Hi, I'm Autumn Schaefer. I'm the statewide coordinator for the California Fire Science Consortium, and today we're here to learn about why houses burn in wildfires and what we can do about it.
And my name is Eric Knapp. I'm a research scientist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station.
Hello, my name is Yana Valachovic. I'm a forest scientist with the University of California in the Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources. And together, Eric and I help support the California Fire Science Consortium.
Today, we're going to present some work that we did in collaboration with Steve Quarles and Nels Johnson on this home loss issue. So there's been a lot of destructive wildfires in California over the past 6 years, including Camp Fire, Tubbs Fire, North Complex, and Carr Fire. A lot of destruction, but it's also an opportunity to learn. So what we wanted to do is see what we could actually learn from comparing homes that survived versus homes that were destroyed. What was different about them? And for this, we focused on the Camp Fire because that was the fire with the most homes lost, and so it's the biggest sample size. So we'll share an analysis we did on that, but we'll also include some examples from the Carr Fire as well. And then we'll finish up with some lessons about building vulnerabilities that were gained from looking at photographs from wildfire damage inspection photographs. And Yana will also give us some recommendations for living in a fire-prone environment at the end.
To set the stage, when we're talking about wildfire and home exposures, it's important to build a little bit of vocabulary in the space and understand kind of what risk buildings face and kind of what frame to think about these issues. So typically we thought about the issue of wildfire coming from somewhere outside the property, burning directly to the structure. So on the left, you see an illustration of that, where you've got, a theoretical forest and you've got flames that come in direct contact with the building because there's continuity of fuels that bring the fire to the building. Now, that's where most of our educational messages have focused, and our work has really been around how do we mitigate the pathways, break up the fuel continuity so that the fire behavior changes and also doesn't directly drive to the structure. What we've learned over the last many decades is that that's part of the equation, but it's more complicated than that. And there are two other types of exposures that are critically important. The one in the middle panel shows embers, or the long distance transfer of burning firebrands, typically from vegetation, but also can be from surrounding structures that are moved through the air column, moved long distance, in some cases up to a mile or more. And those land on, in, or near buildings. So as illustrated here, you can see that we've got ignition adjacent to the structure in the woody vegetation as some of the debris that's collected in the gutter, maybe penetrating the eaves. And so there's an additional challenge associated with that long distance movement. The third component is something we talk about called radiant heat. And it's illustrated here on the right with the ignition of an outbuilding. And while there aren't flames that directly touch the structure, there's heat transfer through the air sufficient to cause some damage on the primary structure. It's illustrated on the right with the window pane breakage, and that creates an opening in the building where either embers or flames are able to get in. So preparing for embers and radiant heat requires additional steps, which have not been so commonly practiced. We chose to work on the Camp Fire, which ignited in November in 2018 for a variety of reasons. On the right, you can see the movement of the fire at around 10:45 after like a 4-hour burn period. It had moved a remarkable distance, driven by wind, came from a down power line, but you can see the pattern of spot fires and ignitions that are happening in front of the flame front. So in Paradise and surrounding communities, a large proportion of the homes were lost in really a 12-hour burn period, which is staggering. But from a research perspective, it actually provides kind of a more uniform condition to analyze how buildings perform on their own with minimal to no fire personnel response. So it creates, in some ways, a more uniform study opportunity as opposed to a fire that has different flavors. At one point, it's more wind driven. At one point, it might be driven in another direction. So the campfire gave us a real, academic place to be able to look at the effect of different building codes and performance of homes on their own.
So for the analysis, we asked 3 questions. Was home survival related to fuels associated with nearby vegetation? Did proximity to nearby burning structures influence home survival? And thirdly, did the California Building Code update that occurred in 2008 improve the odds of home survival? And so for this, what we did is we here on the right here, you see the outline of Paradise. We randomly selected homes from 3 time periods. The ones you see in red here were from 2008 to 2018. So those were built after the building code update in 2008. And then we also selected homes that were built from 1997 to 2007, and those are shown here in green. And so that's an 11-year period, on just bracketing the homes that were built after the building code. And that's for our comparison of how much did the building code change affect the outcome. And then all the other homes in white here are randomly selected single-family homes that were built prior to 1997. And so you notice that in all 3 time periods, the homes are pretty evenly dispersed throughout Paradise. And so we did some pretty simple things to just quantify the effect of vegetation and home fuels. And what we did is, to estimate just visually the canopy cover of tree vegetation right around the randomly selected structures. And we did that in a circle of 30 meters or 98 feet. We also looked at the tree overstory from 30 meters to 100 meters or 320 feet, or 28 feet out from the home. And then after looking at post-fire imagery, we then measured the distance of our randomly selected home to the nearest destroyed structure. We also counted the number of destroyed structures in a 100-meter radius around that home. And so the variables in the model were those 3 time periods that I just described. We also looked at year built within those time periods because it might be a home built in the 1950s might be very different than a home built, say, in the 1990s. Distance to nearest destroyed structure, total structures destroyed within 100 meters, the 2 canopy cover variables. We also looked at the wildland urban intermix and interface, and these are just indicate like the wildland urban intermix is wildland or homes built into the wildland vegetation, whereas interface are more dense developments that are in close proximity to a large contiguous patch of wildland vegetation. So we also looked at slope and all of the variables, recognizing that those the outcome may vary with time. We looked at the interaction with construction time period. And so when we put all of those in a statistical model, the ones that really popped out are shown here in red. Construction time period was important, distance to nearest destroyed structure and total structures destroyed, and the 2 canopy cover variables and the wildland urban interface or intermix are so we had here we answered question 1, was home survival related to fuels associated with nearby vegetation? Our data show yes. Secondly, did the proximity to nearby burning structures influence home survival? And that answer was yes as well. And this graphic just shows some of those variables, some 4 of the more important variables in another form. And so what I'm going to describe here is each of these columns is a time period. The first column is before 1997, the second column 1997 to 2007, the third column 2008 to 2018. And the top row is distance to nearest destroyed structure. And you can see that for at least the last 2 time periods, there's quite a strong relationship with distance to nearest destroyed structure. The farther you are away from a burned structure, the higher your probability of survival. And for a number of destroyed structures within 100 meters, the more destroyed structures that surrounded you, the lower your probability of survival. And in this case, there was a relationship for all 3 time periods. In the former, that relationship broke down for older homes. And then the third row is canopy cover from 0 to 30 meters around a home. And you see here too, especially for the newer homes, that there was a strong relationship with homes that were surrounded by less overstory vegetation, had higher probabilities of survival. Again, that broke down for older homes. And then 30 to 100 meters out from the home, there was also a relationship, especially strong for the newer homes. And you might ask, well, why was it different across times? Well, we think this probably has to do with the fact that older homes have other vulnerabilities than the variables in our models. It might be maintenance. It might be maybe components of the structure, how it was built, and things like that. And so it just swamped out the effects of the variables that we actually were able to look at. So the bottom line here is that neighboring structures on fire, surrounding vegetation, and home age all matter. It's not just about vegetation. And so our third question was about the building codes. Did the 2008 update increase home survival? And the graph in the picture shows the overall housing stock in Paradise and when it was built, and the number of homes built is above in parentheses above a bar. And you see for each decade, for the newer homes, survival started to increase. And here I put damaged and undamaged homes together because in a lot of cases, the damage was fairly minor. The structure was still intact, like it might be a broken window or a charred wall. And you see that, yeah, the newer homes did indeed perform better than older homes. And so the last 2 bars are really what we're comparing. Is 37% survival in 1997 and 2007, significantly different than 44% survival after 2008. And it turns out when you put all of the variables in the model, because all these variables are changing over time as well, when you factor in all of those other variables, that difference is not statistically significant. So we really couldn't tell you that the building code had a significant effect. And we think that a lot of the building code updates were beneficial, but there was just a lot of other building changes that were in place. It wasn't just a change that happened in 2008 that was very distinct. For example, double paned windows were increasingly in use. Cement siding for walls instead of wood siding. That didn't all of a sudden happen in 2008. So it's just not possible to detect that difference. And another thing we did is a decision tree where we put all of the variables in a model and then this tells us a bit of what are the most important variables, and it also gives us some thresholds. For example, well, let me explain this a little bit better. For each of these branches on the decision tree, you'll see a number, and the first number in bold is the proportion surviving, and in parentheses is the percentage of paradise homes that fell into that category. And so what the model shows is that the variable that best distinguished between homes that survived and homes that were destroyed is this distance to nearest destroyed structure. That was the most important. And it gave us a threshold of 18 meters or 59 feet. If you were less than 59 feet from a destroyed structure, your probability of survival was only just a little, it was about 6%. If you were more than 18 meters away from a destroyed structure, that probability of survival goes up to about 35%. So much better probability. Unfortunately, for Paradise, 73.6% of homes in Paradise were less than 18 meters from a destroyed structure. I think that was really part of the problem. So if you were more than 18 meters from a destroyed structure, the next variable that factors in is canopy cover. And it was canopy cover that was some distance from the home. It's not that canopy cover around the home doesn't matter. It's just that that's more variable, because you might have driveways or lawns underneath that canopy around the home. And so the link between canopy cover and the fuels that matter actually break down. But what this shows is that if your canopy cover was over 53%, your probability of survival is much lower. If you were less than 53% canopy cover, the probability of survival goes up to 4.48 or 48%. And 53% canopy cover is actually a pretty high canopy cover value. I got the statistics for my hometown in Reading, and the canopy cover in Reading is somewhere in the low 20% range. And so what this really shows you is that if you have very high canopy cover, your probability of survival is pretty low. But if it's high to low or moderate, the probability goes down or goes up substantially in probability of survival. The next factor that came into play was year built. If you were more than 18 meters from a destroyed structure, had less than 53% canopy cover, and your home was built after 1973, your probability of survival goes up to 0.6 or 60%. And then if your home was built on a lower slope, less than 8%, the probability of survival went all the way up to 73%. So what this shows is that gives you some idea of the variables that matter, and it shows that with some simple if your home had some of these characteristics, your probability of survival was actually much higher than what Paradise had as a whole. Unfortunately, only 7.5% of homes in Paradise met all of these 4 criteria. So now I'm going to spend a little time talking about structure fuels and wildland fuels, because both of those factors were important in the models. And so we're going to come back here to this land use category, wildland urban interface. The picture on the left gives an example of that. Denser development in close proximity to wildland vegetation, whereas intermix is on the right here. And this is houses at a lower density, but put immediately intermixed with the wildland vegetation. And I think with a focus having been in the past on vegetation management as our key to home survival, we would probably anticipate that the wildland urban intermix would perform worse. But what we learned from the Paradise example is that home survival was actually higher in the wildland urban intermix than in the interface. And when we look at the canopy cover, indeed, especially some distance from the home, the canopy cover is a bit higher in the wildland urban intermix, I'm sorry. But the big difference between these two structures was that the distance to nearest destroyed structure was much less in the interface arrangement than intermix arrangement. And what this shows is that it really shows, I think, to me, the importance of this home-to-home fire spread and home loss. It's not just about vegetation, but we also have to consider the fact that surrounding homes are fuels too. And so what are some of the mechanisms of home loss from wildland vegetation? Because yeah, we did indeed see that in the model, that canopy cover was associated with survival, lower canopy cover. One thing we do notice quite often in home loss situations is like the photo on the left. This photo actually comes from Magalia, which is right above Paradise. But what it shows is that you can see that where homes were destroyed, and you notice that where the vegetation is most strongly affected, you can see the vegetation torched out here, is around these destroyed homes. Where you see green trees is where there are no homes. And so I think we have this in our mind oftentimes, that homes are lost because of this flames coming out of the wildlands and impacting homes. And that can indeed happen. But in a lot of cases, somehow the homes are catching fire and they are then affecting the vegetation. It's not a wall of flames necessarily coming out of the vegetation. I think Yana will get into that a little farther in the talk. And so in a lot of cases, what typically ignites is not the green trees, because live vegetation has a high water content. What ignites is the stuff underneath the green trees. It's the dry leaf litter and dead and down fuels. And we think that in areas that had high tree canopy cover, probably also had more leaves on the ground and fuels on the ground, the stuff that ignites for members. And so what this shows, though, is that it's often more a maintenance issue than necessarily a tree and vegetation or a live tree and vegetation issue. That it's possible to disconnect the two. And I'll show that with this slide is landscape trees do not necessarily make a home less fire safe. And we've seen a lot of trees cut down after fires for fire hazard reduction. But we have to keep in mind that in California, trees play a very important role. We live in a hot climate. Trees provide valuable shade. They provide habitat. And it's just important to realize that it is possible to have trees in your landscape and fire safety. You just have to deal with the fuels that come out of those trees, and there are ways to do that. For example, cleaning your gutters, putting gutter guards on, cleaning up the fuels, the leaves that land outside your home. Conversely, stripping the surroundings of vegetation doesn't necessarily guarantee home survival, as you can see from the picture on the right, where the entire lot was rocked, but the home was still lost. So there are other vulnerabilities besides vegetation.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate you setting the stage for all of those issues. So, you know, when you think about the Camp Fire in Paradise, it occurred in November, and really kind of on the shoulder season. The communities of, you know, Paradise and Magalia and the Concal Basin, they're ponderosa pine ecosystems with a heavy component of black oak trees. And so it was the time of leaf drop and fall senescence. And there was a lot of wind behind that fire. And, you know, that brings more of that debris down. And when you think about how ignitions occur, I think looking at these photos gives us a chance to recognize where those vulnerable locations are. So I just want to bring some of these forward to kind of frame the conversation around, how do we live in a fire-prone ecosystem? Where are the places that we need to draw our attention? If we gave a little extra effort, would that improve the odds of survival, should a building be exposed to wildfire, especially one where there aren't sufficient resources to bring crews in, or crews are focused elsewhere, like on, getting us out of harm's way, which was where the focus was in Paradise, right? They had so little time to be able to evacuate that community that's where the effort went, not on, suppression of fires, on or near buildings. So just looking at some examples of flaming and firing directly on structures. Let's look at this one on the upper left, where we've got a roof, and then we've got a dormer, or a small little roof section protruding from the roof. And what that creates is this perfect, right angle where debris can get caught. So the leaves, the needles, maybe some of the cones, tend to lodge in the locations like that. And embers can land on that, and it's perfect prime dry material for ignition. And in that situation, you've got, a Class A roof, but the wall is asked to perform as well as the roof. And so without some attention to detail at that transition point, it's pretty easy to ignite that siding if it's wood, for example, or if the flashing isn't quite sufficient. So upgrading that transition point is something that I'd like to promote when people are thinking about these issues. There's also this roof gutter to roof edge component. Now we need gutters because gutters keep rain from damaging the lower portion of our siding, and we get degradation in the overall building, but they're also a perfect catchment for debris. And it's hard to clean out gutters. I totally recognize that. But if you get ignition in one of those gutters, it's possible to get flames basically going right underneath the roof and penetrating at the roof edge, and you can get flames entering the roof decking and then the attic pretty easily. So being aware of the vulnerability that gutters present is an important issue. I like non-combustible gutter guards. None of them are really tested at this point, but I think you get the idea that if you can keep the debris out of the gutter, then you might have, if you have ignition, it's going to be on top of the roof and not at the edge of the roof. There's also this labyrinth of fuels that we connect between our buildings, and I call those fences. They're great for keeping our pets and our kids safe and giving us privacy, but they also form as tremendous pathways or wicks to our structures. The photo on the right is from the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa, and you can see that the fence is what is bringing the flame to that structure. What we recommend is not necessarily replacing the whole fence, but replacing the attachment point with something that's non-combustible, so that if you do get ignition in the fence, it doesn't carry directly to the house. So there's another component, and these two bottom images are taken from a laboratory, but what they show is how our buildings are vented. There's both inflow and outflow vents. So the one on the right is the under eave vents, which is where you get cool air in. And then the gable in vent, the one on the left, is where the hot, moist air is sent out. But in both cases, with a screen size of 1/4 inch, which is what is most common, they are quite porous. And so they can both let that air in and out, but it also can allow embers of sufficient size to penetrate. And so those little weird squiggly lines are sparks of those embers coming through the vents. And depending on what they land on, they can create ignition inside the building. And then the building sort of appears to burn from the inside out. The great news is that we've been able to show that with a finer mesh screen of 1/8 inch metal, you might have a little bit of ember penetration, but they won't be of size to be able to have durability to ignite whatever they land on. There's also some new technology innovation in this space, and there's vents that are designed both to resist embers and flame. So a vent upgrade throughout the building can do a tremendous amount to protect the structure from embers. So using this framing, here's some kind of lessons. Let's look at of the buildings that survived in the campfire, how do they perform and what lessons can we see? So these all come from the damage inspection data, and they are just a huge resource to be able to look at what surviving structures faced and what were some of the challenges. So what we saw when we looked at the percentage of damaged homes is that 63% of them were damaged from radiant heat. And the images that Eric showed with those the vegetation not being impacted unless there were structures near it, really give a great example of how much heat can come off those burning buildings. And, and if there's close proximity between buildings, that you can get a lot of issue. What we didn't see was flame to fuel connectivity. It was less than 10% in the total overall. So, that has some interesting ways to be able to think about, it's important to mitigate fuels and mitigate pathways coming forward. But of the damaged buildings, we saw most of our issue coming from radiant heat. So here's just a couple examples. I'll look at the lower right one. You can see perhaps fuel continuity as it came from the wildland. It looks like some oak trees there directly towards the structure. But what we saw more was radiant heat damages on those broken windows. We don't have the privilege to know what was adjacent to that, to what caused the radiant heat damage, but it had to have been pretty significant to break those windows. I will admit the building on the right, I'm surprised that it survived. It had probably a vinyl siding. That's why you see that the upper right, you see all that melted and kind of warped look. There were a lot of, adjacent fuels, both in the plants that they selected. But that led only to the melting of the siding, which to me is a surprise. You could also see how well the roof performed. There were a lot of debris that was collected on top of the roof. That's what that black line is. That smoldered and burned, but it didn't create, it didn't have a pathway in. And so, that was probably the result of embers landing on that and creating an ignition on the roof. But the roof performed really well, which is what we hope. And then the last one on the lower right is really just embers getting into either the gutter there or some element of the corner. And you can see how a gutter fire can then transition into exposing the eaves and the roof edge. So these are small, little events. And when someone's not there to do some suppression activities, they can lead to loss of the whole structure. So here's a couple more examples. The one on the right, you can see that pathway concept I was talking about earlier, where there was a privacy fence. You can see the charred remnants of some of the posts that are along there. It was connected to the structure. This looks like the wall was made of stucco, but the under eave area was some kind of wood. And once the fence ignited, there was enough flame to be able to cause damage to the under eave area and the roof area. So would have been simple to have basically prevented that pathway. And you can see how much damage happened. The car ignited in front of the building and others. Radiant heat can also come from vegetation. So the one in the middle here is the ignition of the planted, or it looks like sort of wild vegetation around that structure. We both had ignition on top of the roof from the debris, but then you can see how the fascia, which is that board hanging down, was damaged as a result of the vegetation that ignited. The one on the top right, radiant heat to wall and window. And, there is this nice sidewalk around the structure, which is terrific. That really gives some separation. But what we can't see is what ignited nearby to that structure. But you can see how vulnerable a building can be. And, that determination of 54 feet between structures is really quite fascinating to think about. I know most people tend to dial into like, well, my home is the thing I worry about the most, but I care a little bit less about the woodshed or the pump house or the detached garage. I can live with it if those go. But that may be the domino effect that leads to the loss of the primary structure. So thinking about the home hardening and defensible space across all buildings is really important so that you can prevent things like on the upper right. Lower left, we tend to put a lot of fine fuels around our structures to both protect the moisture loss and be able to prevent weed growth. But that bark mulch is really ignitable. And so here's bark mulch to wall. A pretty easy pathway to break, creating some separation from the building from all those fuels is really critical. The one in the middle, gutter fires, relatively obvious. And then the one on the lower right, fuel comes in many forms, and we have lots of stuff that we collect. We tend to tuck them underneath our eaves to keep them out of the rain or the elements, but they can provide fuel for the fire and create, again, that wick directly to the structure. So Is that me? No, that's you, Eric. Sorry.
So yeah, I'm going to just wrap things up with some conclusions. And what our first question was home survival related to fuels associated with nearby vegetation? And the answer to that was yes, even though our vegetation variable was pretty coarse. We looked at overstory canopy cover, which as I described, was probably not actually the variable that caused the vegetation to be a problem. It was the fuels associated with that live vegetation. Did proximity to nearby burning structures influence home survival? The answer too was yes. And so oftentimes we don't consider the fact that the amount of fuel in a burning home or a burning structure, a shed, is actually dwarfs the amount of fuel that is in a lot of wildland urban areas in the wildlands. And we have to consider that too. A nearby burning structure is really a problem for home survival. And that's how a lot of homes are lost in these destructive wildfires. So it's not that vegetation is not important, but we have to keep in mind that you got to deal with both the surrounding vegetation and the threats posed by nearby burning structures. They're both important factors. And in a lot of destructive wildfires, substantial losses are caused by this house-to-house fire spread. And a lot of that may be because of radiant heat. Once one burning structure, once one structure catches fire, it just is like dominoes to the next one. So the third question we asked is, did California Building Code update in 2008 improve the odds of survival? In our analysis, we weren't able to detect a significant effect of that. But we do think the building codes, what they mandated, those are helpful. We know that double pane windows are better than single pane windows. We know that the better, more fireproof exterior coatings are beneficial. But it's not just about the building codes. Oftentimes what causes homes to be lost are what we do once the building has been built. It's about maintenance, about storing flammable objects like Yana talked about, sheds, wood fences that we attach to our homes, and other issues that cause the house to be lost. But one of the more positive takeaways from this is that it could have been that home loss is a completely random factor, that there's just so many that's really hard to do anything in this situation. But we saw really strong associations with some simple variables, which to us suggests that there are fixes which could substantially improve the outcomes that we see. So this 59-foot threshold that we found from distance to nearest destroyed structure being what best distinguished between survivors and homes that were destroyed. Well, then to keep in mind that that's the greater than the average separation distance in many wildland urban interface neighborhoods. And so what this also shows is that we really have to do fuel reduction at a community scale. Because if you do all the work around your house and prepare your house for fire and your neighbor does not, your neighbor's house catches on fire could still influence the destruction of your house. So we have to do it. We have to think more broadly at a community scale. One caveat here is that our analysis, it came from homes and housing in Paradise, but we think a lot of these variables, they apply more broadly,
Northern California or beyond. And if you want to read more about this work, we have a paper in Fire Ecology that of where a lot of these analyses came from, and it's shown on the bottom of the slide. So Yana is now going to share with us summaries of what we can do.
All right. Well, I'm going to take us home and sort of kind of scale up and think about these principles at a broad scale. I just, really want to say, I think we humbly approached this issue thinking that we weren't going to find strong statistical relationships. And, much to our surprise, we really did. And, it does a little bit of confirmation bias at some level, but it also really reinforces a lot of the lab experiments as well as the post-fire investigations that have been happening all over the United States and especially in the American West as we try and learn from these tragedies and from that, figure out how we can, live in these fire-prone ecosystems. It's really not about one building product. It's really a coupled approach between the product, the design, and the maintenance, and really thinking about how we respect and understand the whole variety of fuels that exist in the landscape. Petroleum products are fuels too. So it's more than just wood. It's really the whole landscape together of how we design, construct, and maintain our structures and the area immediately around that. So I opened with the idea around direct flame contact, embers, and radiant heat. And so, what can we do about that? Well, the direct flame contacts issue is really about, we use in California the term defensible space, which is basically interrupting the pathways for fire to travel to the structure, changing the arrangement so that the fire might move out of the canopy of whatever the vegetation is to a more moderate fire behavior and flame height such that you can do suppression work. So what does that really mean? At the local scale, it really means removing the bark mulch and the gorilla hair and the other things that we plant, we put our plants in. It also means, thinking about that wood fence to house connection and trying to break that pathway. And as shown a little bit here on the right, thinking about planting in islands or smaller groupings so that there's a matrix in between where maybe fire doesn't carry from one planting group to the next. So it's not scorched earth. It's just being a little more thoughtful about where we maintain and choose to focus our vegetation. Now, the ember issue is a mixture of both the home hardening and defensible space work. So, I mentioned a couple ideas around the vents, the gutters, but I also want to draw your attention to that vegetation that's shown in the middle graphic that's, sort of surrounding the structure, kind of anchoring it, giving a visual anchor. But that creates tremendous vulnerability for the building. So in California, we're adding a new defensible space zone. It's being termed Zone 0. It's the first 5 feet around the structure. So by implementing that element of fuel reduction and hardening the building, we'll have a much better chance of having our structures be more resilient to embers. And then the third component is the radiant heat piece. And, to address it, it's a combination also of home hardening and fuel reduction. So what does it really mean? We need to protect all buildings. The shed as shown here is just as important as the main structure. If we can't move the shed or our lots are tighter, we really have to think about the home hardening elements on the primary structure and then also on our adjacent structures. So in this case, where the two buildings are facing each other, installing tempered glass windows, which have more heat resistive qualities, 3 times more than the traditional glass windows we install. And really scaling up to work with your community and your neighborhood. So Eric, so how does that really manifest, and what does it mean to break the pathways for wildfire exposure at a community scale? Well, here's what I'd recommend. Lead by example. It's easy to point fingers at the neighbor and say, well, if they would only do just that, then maybe I would do that. I would say start at the scale that you can manage, which is your own place. So here we show the 3 defensible space zones, Zone 0, 0 to 5 feet. In California, Zone 1 is 5 to 30 feet. And then the third zone, Zone 2 is 30 to the edge of the property line or 100 feet. So getting comfortable with the idea that that new defensible space zone around the structure is important is really critical, especially as we start talking about the insurance challenges we're all facing. So in the middle panel, you see that there is a gate upgrade. That gate is non-combustible. So the fence is still there, but the gate prevents the wicking of the flames directly to the structure. We also see that that some of the home hardening elements are illustrated around thinking about the vents, windows, and gutters, and what work can be done there. And then there's, this idea of trying to respect or illustrate what planting groups might look like and islanding those. So, that you still have beauty and you still have things that are in focal points that are really important, both for shade as well as, something to catch your eye from your sitting spot inside your house or as you approach the building, but they just have discontinuity from one planting group to the next. And then, concluding with the idea with a shed that all buildings get the same treatments. And so you see zone 0 coming around that shed as well. So we've got just a couple more slides here. Both Eric and I had the chance to work on the Carr fire, which occurred in 2018, if I remember correctly. It's in Redding, California, and we've got some images related to that. And so, here was a close call. In this case, we had what I would interpret as, firefighter response and suppression activities that occurred. There were some things that were great. I mean, look at the rock mulch that's used around the building. The challenge was that there were woody shrubs that were within that matrix. Those woody shrubs ignited from embers. They've moved over the green grass. One of those or several of those shrubs ignited. They created radiant heat exposure, which led to the window being broken as well as damage to the wall. And so that created a pathway for a fire to come in. It took fire suppression resources to be able to save the building, but I'm sure the damage is rather significant. So what's the solution? You don't need a plant right there. Pull the vegetation back from the structure. I'd like the non-combustible gravel or rock that's used around there. I'd also like to see a different attachment point for that fence so that if we got ignition in the fence, it doesn't bring it directly to the structure. Anything else, Eric?
Yeah, I would say that it probably wasn't the green shrub that ignited, but you notice how dense this shrub is. It makes it very difficult to clean out the leaf litter underneath the shrub, which is probably what the embers ignited on and then torched out the green material of the shrub. Okay. So, yeah, just also just looking at the density and the ease of cleaning underneath shrub is important too. Right,
and as we trim those shrubs, all the debris just falls right to the base. Those were all sculpted there. Here's an example from the Carr fire of a surviving structure. When I went to this community, I think there were 18 homes. This would be in the more of the intermix look, and all of them succumbed but this one home. And this person had built his structure with a lot of thought towards fire, and there was a lot of ways that he designed his cement pathways to interrupt the pathway for fire. He did a bunch of home hardening choices that really made a difference. But what was nice about this, so we still see some landscaping, but it, in this case, manzanita is very well pruned up. So is the oak tree there. And what's in the base is really a succulent, which has much higher moisture content. So there was some maintenance element here that really made a difference in the structure, as well as, the thought about how the walkways and the home hardening would interplay with fire exposure. So here's, another example where, those thought and action, there was no fire suppression resources dedicated to the structure, but the structure survived on its own. And, as we conclude, I just really want to thank the great team that we worked with, Celeste Abbott from Pacific Southwest Station, Zeke Lunder from Deer Creek Resources, who gave us field trips and some wonderful visual resources, Nick Wallingford, who helped us with the DINS data and other resources. We gained a tremendous amount of confidence, really, in doing this work to feel quite strongly that it's possible to live in California. And it's possible to rebuild in California and do that successfully. But it just takes paying a little bit more attention to some of the things that just were kind of sitting before us, but weren't that obvious. So here are several photos from buildings from the post-fire environment in the campfire footprint. This is from Paradise. And you can see that, there is life coming back into Paradise. People are rebuilding, and that's a wonderful thing. And they're making interesting choices. So like in the middle, we saw a building that are using the new flame and ember resistant vents. And, that's mandated by law now, of course, but it's just nice to see that illustration. You can see that the panel below that, they are really focused in on creating that zone 0. The gate is non-combustible and how it attaches the fence to the structure. So, some great attention to some of the key principles. But then there are some places where maybe a little more fine tuning to come into play. So the structure on the top right, is wonderful to give an opportunity for a family to come back. To clean it all up, someone sprayed a bunch of bark mulch all around it and kind of softened the edges. So a great, bed of fuel, though someone came back through and raked that fuel away from the structure. So zone 0 is beginning to be implemented. It's got a tall foundation, which is great. I would love just to see a little more discontinuity with that bark mulch so that you don't just have a way for flame to run directly to the structure. And then, the image on the lower right, a little room for improvement there. The fence directly attaches to the structure. There are, a lot of woody mulch up against the building, woody plants there. So there's going to be some opportunity for growth, shall we call it, as we continue to refine our understanding of what it takes to live and thrive in the tremendous California Mediterranean ecosystem. So thanks for your attention, and we look forward to continuing conversation with you all if you've got questions around our work and what we found here.